Greetings, this is your Project 1 critique. We're going to start here with Sasha's images. We look at these, my first impression is they're all slightly underexposed. They could use a little bit more light into the camera. I do kind of like the composition here. It seems like we have two. We have this set up here, and then we have these three images here, but we'll go in there and try and look at them more closely and see what we get. Yep, they do still feel somewhat underexposed, and they also have a graininess to them, and this is something that happens with underexposed digital photographs. We get what referred to as noise, and these are discolored pixels, and that can happen via underexposure, or it can also happen at higher ISOs. Now 1600 historically would have been a high ISO. In today's world, 1600 isn't a super high ISO, so it's probably some combination of a somewhat high ISO and a somewhat underexposed image. We're at f32 at 0.3 seconds. We probably need to be at about 4, 5, 6 seconds here to get a more proper exposure of the image. So, so that's the technical end. Looking at these images of these three, which one is the most interesting? I kind of like this one. There's a little more attitude in there, and the framing. This seems beyond just a portrait of someone. The facial expression, is communicating something more complex than just a smiling figure. So I kind of like how that is constructed in this photograph. So of these three, it's funny with the face, very small changes can make a big difference in how people interpret what you're thinking or feeling. And for me, that's the most interesting one right there. All three of them are somewhat underexposed. I think these are also, though I like the structure of this image. The other one's pretty much just the same photograph but zoomed in. But they have a very different feel. We get them that zoomed in, more traditional portrait with the previous three images. With this one, it's not what we'd typically call a portrait photograph, but it offers me more information, which I like to see. I get more environment. I see artwork on the walls, the furniture, arrangement, even shoes and bags in the background, all kind of add to the things. Well, it's interesting here. We get a color shift as we look at these. So this one's slightly less exposed, more exposed. Quarter at f22 here. And if we look at this one, this is f2.8 at 1/320th of a second. So those are somewhat similar in exposures. So I don't know if your camera is telling you something wrong, but they're all slightly underexposed. We just need to get a little bit more light. I think 1, maybe 2 stops more of light. So instead of an eighth, if we went down to 1 second, that probably would have been plenty. With that previous one. I'm trying to see if there's any much difference here as far as, here the hair is the biggest difference. So I don't think there's a tremendous amount of change in what's going on in the composition. It is well composed. It's interesting. It just technically needs to push things. Also, we don't see too much difference with the aperture, and that's because we're taking in a wider angle scene. And if we have a wider angle lens, 24 millimeters, fairly wide angle. So that isn't going to change too much. The depth of field isn't going to change too much with the aperture when we're taking a bigger scene with a wider angle lens. And that's one thing we learn as we explore photography more, is that focal length lens can almost sometimes more dramatically affect depth of field than the aperture that you select. A super long lens, almost any aperture you check is going to have select is going to have a narrow depth of field. And with a wide angle lens, almost any aperture you select is going to have a fairly large depth of field, unless you get really close to the subject with that wide angle lens. So that the distance between the subject, the length, the focal length, the lens, and the aperture are the three things that affect that depth of field and what's in focus. So that was sort of neutralized in this composition, though it's an interesting composition. So, All right, well, those are some thoughts for you, Sasha. We're going to move on here and take a look at Meghan's images. And, this one seems kind of fun, playful. There's very much, the mugs to Supermom. Then we have her facial expression. We have the little pow exploding thing behind that. And then, we're playing with that here. The eyes, hair seems to be like power, ready to go. Also playing with that idea of coffee, caffeine. Um, so I think the grayscale works well for the image. Certainly doesn't distract me or make the image boring. I personally like grayscale images, but sometimes they can take away interesting visual characteristics. That doesn't seem to be happening here. This seems to be the post-caffeine crash. I actually kind of like that image the best. It seems, this seems to be our ideal and our hope, and then we have our reality of just trying to sometimes get through the day. So I think you play that character, very well, and you express those ideas. I'm kind of assuming that's what you're shooting for. All right. Okay, so let's look at this one. I like the structure of this. I like how we're slightly off-centered, pushed to the left, and I also like the imbalance. Like there's a little more gray and a little more texture here, and here it's almost just white. I kind of really like that balance between those two areas. And then of course your gaze looking off up there too. One thing I noticed is that all these images seem just slightly soft. This one's sharp. See, everything's sharp. The mug's sharp, the eyeglasses. This one and this one are slightly soft. I don't know if the focus is slightly off or, shutter speed's 1/100 That's fairly quick. Shouldn't make too much difference. This one also seems slightly soft. So, though this one also has a grainy quality to it, and you jacked up your ISO to a fairly high number, that can add what we refer to as noise. And when we get, they're discolored pixels, as I explained earlier. But when we go to grayscale, we don't see the discoloration, but we do get this gritty, almost sand grain. And it's very similar to what we would get when we're shooting film, and if we underexposed film or overdeveloped film, or even overexposed film. If you don't expose it right and develop it right, you can get exaggerated grain. That's how this image feels. It also has kind of a nice look to it, more of a pictorialist feel. The pictorialist purposefully made their images soft, out of focus, and grainy. This seems almost intentful. It doesn't actually bother me, but it is technically a technical issue. But I think it works expressively in this photograph in particular. All right, well, let's keep moving here. We're going to move on from Meghan. We're going to look at Molly's images. When I look at these, I can obviously see some that are underexposed. And this is probably a nice proper exposure. I don't think anything's overexposed, but you can see there's a slight difference here. This one's slightly underexposed. This is probably, I would say, spot on. This is a stop, maybe 2 stops underexposed. This one might be just a little bit overexposed, and we can see the difference in skin tone. I don't know if you played with any photo editing software, Photoshop, GIMP, something else to adjust these images, or if they're straight out of the camera. But when we're dealing with portraiture, especially professional photographers who are doing this for a living, they have to be careful. If they're taking pictures of a person, they want to maintain a consistency in skin tone and value and color. And we can see what slight differences. I'm going to take this image and just look at the aperture and shutter speed if I can. Okay, so we have f5 at 1/60th. If I move over here, I'm f18 at 1/5. So f5, 5.6, 8, 11, 16. There's almost a 4-stop difference in aperture, but shutter speed, let's see what we have here. I'm trying to remember what this was. It was a 60th here and a 5th. So then 60th, half that, 30th, 15th, 8th, quarter. It's also a 4-stop difference, which is kind of interesting because that works out to be in the same amount of light, but something changed here. I don't know if the lighting changed, a cloud came in, or maybe my math is off a bit, or maybe the ISO I didn't take in consideration. It's 200 there and 200 here, or perhaps you did some editing. as we look at these images. This also has a more intense saturation. And this one seems a bit more normal. And this kind of makes me think maybe you did play with an editing software as I look at this one, simply because the saturation is different and the brightness of it, which technically should be similar to this. So, all right, anyways, it's okay to use a little editing software. Most photographs need that. All right, so now if I just look at composition, there's some thoughts on the technical end of things. If I look at composition, what's more interesting? You know, I like this. You're playing lots of different roles here. You know, this is more your straight on. It's not one of those perfect portraits because your hair is slightly askew, but it looks kind of nice and adds something to the image, I would say, as opposed to everything being perfect. And then, you know, expressive here, but very playful imagery. I kind of like these two. So it's funny, you have the same scene, essentially the same composition in all these images, but you really do alter what people are thinking and looking at and thinking about with the images simply by how you interact with yourself and how you, you're not even using props, you're just changing, you know, hands, gestures, you know, pulling on your hair, things like that. It's kind of interesting study in how we can change content, meaning, etc. You know, just with very simple movements, changes in gesture, changes in facial expression. So, all right. Anyways, there are some thoughts. I'm going to move on and try and do one more here. We'll look at Demi's images, and she's, you know, titles this "False Reality," and I think looking back and reading some of her earlier posts and what her thoughts were, you know, she's very spot on how we can use photography to create that reality. And these seem to create, you know, a sense of, you know, there's, I don't know how to put this. Yeah, I can see the creation and what could be reflected as a false reality. Now, of these 4 photographs, the one I like the best, I really like this image. I like the balance of light here. You know, I think it looks like a flash fired. It did fire, so you know, and that helps fill in this. But the nice thing is how you balance that flash with the ambient light around it. It's kind of a challenging scene. You know, you wouldn't be able to light the figure up this much without that flash. So that was a good choice. But also choosing the longer exposure, 0.8 seconds in a fairly wide aperture. I like how I see the sky here, and I like seeing the texture in the water and the pool around this. It's a very well balanced and constructed photograph. And it's interesting technically, conceptually, compositionally. You know, I think this image is probably the best one. This one here could use some of the stuff the other one had, a longer exposure, a wider aperture, more information. I don't like the inky black background in there. You know, this is your sort of happy smiling face construct, typical portrait image hamming up for the camera. And it also feels like a photograph that most people would take. They just let the flash go off and not worry about the rest of it, you know, so seems like a little less skilled in that sense. This image comes across as very skilled. I think it's also more interesting compositionally too. So, all right. So here we are looking at this, and the flash did fire again. I was wondering that too. Just the way the light is there, lighting up the face, a lot of light there, and then the background's a little bit darker. So, you know, yeah, it does feel that like glamour shot. I was just reading your thoughts a little bit. It'd be interesting to see some here where you didn't use the flash. I think all these utilize the flash. And I'm curious, and I know you have some because I remember seeing the portfolio earlier. I really like the one where you're near the house and there's a shadow of a tree next to you. I thought that was a really well composed and interesting, engaging image. But I think what you're going for here is this more modelly sort of look, which you certainly achieved with this portfolio, to really play up that idea. So I like how you're thinking about the concept and trying to create a body of work and not just the random good photographs. And so it works for this project because seeing all that other exploration, you're certainly exploring aperture as you need to be, and to some degree understanding that. So anyways, there are some thoughts for you, and I will move along.